This presentation is not very well structured, I must tell you right at the outset, because I asked Mr. Muttaya as to what I should speak about, and he said, speak about Egmore. And then I asked Mr. Gabriel Satyanathan as to what I should speak about. He said, speak about the Kirk. So I combined the two and put it on the title. The length of the presentation depends entirely on how hungry you feel. Whenever you get up and leave, I will stop the presentation then and there. Every slide has a story, so it can be stopped at any given point of time. So let's start with Egmore itself. Why the name? There are certain WhatsApp messages that keep going all around the city, very authentically giving you information as to why certain localities have been named in a certain way. And Egmore has got some of the interesting stories that come in that WhatsApp messages, that this is the town or this is that part of Chennai where the sunrise happens first. So this is known as Ur, so it is known as Egmore. Well, you would have thought that the beach is where the sun rises first and not in Egmore. Then you've got this fact that it was the 7th village to be rented by the British from the Nawab of Arcot. Sadly enough, it happens to be the 6th village and not the 7th village. So it should have been Aram Ur and not Geram Ur. And then in the English East India Company records itself, these are all the options. Fill in the blanks or tick the right answer. Yelumuru, Yigamuru, Elamboru, Yegumoru, Elambur, Eghambur, Egumuru, and so on. So the English were themselves as confused as all of us. But this is a very ancient locality because there is an inscription in Tiruvattriyur dating to 1264, which records the donation of a person who came from Yerumur to that temple. So the name probably goes back to the 13th century or even earlier, but we have no clear idea as to why it is Egmore, just as we don't have any clear idea as to why it is Madras or Chennai or any of that. All very confusing. But one of the earliest buildings that are recorded in Egmore after the English came here is the Egmore Redoubt, which is a small fort-like structure that Governor George Morton Pitt built in 1710, 100 feet by 100 feet, and located within which the soldiers were supposed to defend the western part of what was then Madras. This building later also becomes a sanatorium for the soldiers who are not very well. And for a long time, apparently till 1930s or so, we had a road called the Redoubt Road in Egmore. And that is today the Gandhi-Irvin Bridge Road. So the redoubt stood somewhere there, after which it was demolished, and it is believed that much of the railway quarters of Egmore came up on the place where the Egmore Redoubt once stood. So that really is the origin and the end of the redoubt. The man who built the St. Andrew's Kirk, Thomas Fiott de Havilland, who came from a village called Guernsey in an island of England. Havilland came to Madras in the closing years of the 18th century, somewhere in the 1780s or 1790s, participated in the wars against Tipu Sultan, especially in the final war against him in 1799, and was then positioned in Srirangapatnam. He was a man who belonged to what we would call today as the Corps of Engineers of the Army. And these were the people, in fact, the Army engineers were the people who really built most of the early buildings that we can recognize as of British origin in this city. They were the architects and they were also the engineers who put up those structures. So Havilland, when he was in Mysore, was asked to build a banqueting hall to commemorate the fall of Tipu Sultan by Sir John Malcolm, and he put up a banqueting hall with a minimum number of pillars in it. Secondly, he also put in a proposal where he said that the entire river Kaveri can be bridged by a 5-arched structure. And nobody believed him because they said that such a bridge cannot really stand given the torrential flow of the water, not in Tamil Nadu but in Karnataka. And you know that the torrential flow of water when it rains, and the bridge is quite likely to get washed away. But he then put up a freestanding structure inside his own garden in Srirangapatnam to prove that this bridge can be built. That structure stood till 1945. It was put up in 1799 or 1800 and people hadn't believed him. And that freestanding structure stood till 1945 when it collapsed due to lack of maintenance. And even today the ruins of that structure can be seen in Srirangapatnam. And then finally the Kaveri Bridge was built as per the design that he had specified in 1810 or so. So he was a remarkable engineer. Coming to Madras, interestingly, he also mutinies against the army in the early 1800s in Mysore. He is court-martialed for that, and then he is pardoned, and then he comes to Madras and joins the Corps of Engineers over here. And that is when he is entrusted with the task of building two churches. One church, the first one being St. George's Cathedral, which is on Cathedral Road, and the second one, St. Andrew's Kirk, in whose compound we are all sitting today. In those days, as of now, cut paste was the technology that most people followed. And the Haviland was no exception to that. He had already hit upon the original plan that he wanted to bring into Madras, and that was the Church of St. Martin's in the Field in London, designed by James Gibbs. And he decided that what James Gibbs had done in London would do very well for Madras. So both St. George's Cathedral and then St. Andrew's Kirk, then St. John's Church in Calcutta, the Kirk in Calcutta, they all follow the same master plan, which is of this particular church with minor variations in it. So the original this is the bridge that he recommended, and then that came up over the river Kaveri in Srirangapatnam. Even today you can see this particular bridge over there. Before he started building the two churches in Madras, he worked on a very, very interesting project, which was the construction of a protective wall for Fort St. George and for Blacktown. And that's known as the Great Madras Bulwark. And this one he completed before he started work on either of the churches. And it was a magnificent piece of engineering. He wanted to prevent the sea from coming into either the fort or into Blacktown. And you must remember, at that time there was no harbour. We are looking at early 1800s. And the sea was separated from the fort by a distance of just around 500 feet. And so in high tide, the sea would actually come and lash the walls of Fort St. George. Blacktown also had a similar problem. So the Great Madras Bulwark was built. You can see the bulwark as it was constructed with the Church of St. Mary's over there in Fort St. George. You can see the flagstaff, you can see the governor's house, and you can see the exchange building, which is today the museum in Fort St. George. All of them with the great bulwark standing in front of it. And then this is the bulwark as planned, with Fort St. George ending over here, and then the buildings of First Line Beach, which is Parry's Corner, the post office, and other such buildings that would come up later over there. All of them with this protective wall in front of them. 200,000 tons of blocks of stone were transported from St. Thomas Mount and Pallavaram using convict labor to bring them to the beach front, and then these stones were all dropped into the sea. Some of the blocks of stone individually weighed as much as 2 tons. And when completed, it was found that the sea had stopped coming into the land and there was considerable protection afforded. The work continued almost till 1821 or 1822. So a good 5 to 6 years was spent, or 10 years was spent in the construction of the bulwark. Now, where is the Madras Bulwark today? That is the important question. How many of you are familiar with the Reserve Bank of India subway? That is where the bulwark existed, and when the subway was built, much of the stonework really resurfaced. Similarly, the harbour, the buildings that stand on one end of the harbour, much of them are on the Madras Bulwark itself. So there is this stonework is not publicly visible anymore. It is somewhere deep down under the ground. But that was a piece of work that de Havilland did. Then he worked on constructing the St. George's Cathedral on Cathedral Road. Mr. Muthaiya mentioned about how the church in St. Mary's was built. And initially, as you all know, that was the church to which all the English went. Now in 1799, With Tipu Sultan dead and no further threat of invasion to Madras, the English began to become brave. And they stepped outside of Fort St. George and began building houses in places that were known as the Great Chowdhury Plain, what we would today recognize as much of Mount Road, Nungambakam, Egmore and other places. And the moment they started building their houses there, they stopped going to the church in St. Mary's. Getting up on a Sunday morning and going to church anyway must have been a pretty tough task. And as you were far away, you also said the distances were considerable, so nobody was going there. And in any case, the English themselves were becoming ambitious, and they decided that they needed a proper cathedral for themselves in the city. And Bishop Middleton in Calcutta, by then Calcutta was the headquarters, he had said that he was very disappointed with the ugly nature of all the churches being built all over India. And he said that he hoped that the new cathedral that was going to come up in Madras would be a good one. So our friend Thomas Fiott de Havilland, having already plagiarized the design from London, presented it as the new design. This was duly approved, and so St. George's Cathedral was built and was completed in 1817. The first burial in the church being that of Havilland's wife, Elizabeth. He had married her here and she also passed away here, and that was the first burial to take place in this churchyard. Now comes the construction of St. Andrew's Kirk. And while St. George's Cathedral does not have a dome on top of it, St. Andrew's Kirk does have a dome, as you all know, right in the center. And that is a more faithful copy of St. Martin's in the Field. Now, St. Martin's in the Field Church has a dome that is made of timber and lead. It doesn't have a masonry dome. The challenge was, how do you replicate the dome in Madras? And Havilland had very clearly decided that he did not want a timber dome in Madras, mainly because of the problem of moisture and the problem of white ants. See, white ants were everywhere in this city. In fact, there are many church records continuously talk about how the pulpit was constructed and within 6 years was completely destroyed by the white ants. In fact, there is a very interesting record in St. Mary's about how, as the Reverend mounted the pulpit, the whole structure subsided, having been eaten up by white. What were they doing till that time when the whole structure was tottering? I have no idea. But the question was, how do you construct a freestanding dome out of brick and mortar? And how do you show that it can stand? Now, our friend had already shown that an arch can stand in Srirangapatnam as a freestanding structure. So he decided to build a dome in the garden of his house in Madras and demonstrated to the Scots who were here that a dome could be constructed. And that dome was constructed in the space between these two buildings that you see. In fact, these were his houses. This is the western castlet, and that is the eastern castlet on Mount Road. And today, eastern castlet and western castlet on Mount Road. And today you will recognize these two buildings as the headquarters of Addison and Company and Rayala Towers. That is, these are the two buildings that now stand where the western castlet or the east, I forget which now, eastern castlet and western castlet. Now these stand where Addison and Company and Rayala Towers today stand. So this entire property was Havilland's, and the arch, the dome must have come up somewhere in the middle. And for constructing the dome, he used native artisans. He got hold of the local masons and he entrusted them with the task of building a freestanding dome. And the dome stood successfully, and then he decided that he could get on with the work when it came to constructing the kirk over here. The other question was that St. George's Cathedral is on relatively hard soil, whereas St. Andrew's Kirk is much too close to the river for comfort, and this was soft soil. And so he then decided that he had to get hold of local technology once again, and this is when he identifies the well diggers, and he gets them to be involved in this particular project. Now, the well diggers by themselves are not de Havilland's identification. They go back a good 10 years prior to de Havilland to a man called Moorhouse, Geoffrey Moorhouse, who was part of the East India Company and who died in the siege of Srirangapatnam in the battle against Tipu Sultan. And the most interesting fact is that when Moorhouse died in Srirangapatnam, a cenotaph was constructed for him in Bangalore, and then the body was brought to Madras. The funeral procession began where the Kirk is standing today. The funeral procession began at the Masonic Lodge, which existed where the St. Andrew's Kirk is. So there was a Freemasons Hall in this particular property, and then there was much music, there was a procession, and then Moorhouse was taken and his body was buried in Fort St. George, which is where this monument was put up later. Henry Dodwell, in his records of the Nawabs of Madras, says that this is the ugliest monument in the whole country. I would well agree with him. But Moorhouse is to be remembered because of one thing. Moorhouse was the man who identified that the natives had a way of digging wells. And that was by creating a terracotta shell, which they would then beat into the ground, and it would be continuously beaten till it touched the rock bed. And then people would get in and they would keep extricating the debris from the middle, and having removed all the soft soil from the center of the terracotta ring, they would fill it with all hard stones and other things that would not change in shape when water floods it. And then on top of that, buildings would be constructed. So this was entirely native technology. And there were two kinds of wells that were used. One were brick wells, the other was terracotta wells. The brick wells were the ones that went right up to 50 feet under the ground. In those days, today, you know, bore wells are dug at 300 feet, 400 feet and all that. If you dig a little further, you probably land in the United States of America without a visa. But the point is that in those days, 50 feet was remarkable. And so the brick wells were used for going up to 50 feet. The terracotta wells were used for going up to 10 feet into the ground. The brick wells were all 4 feet in diameter, while the terracotta wells were 3 feet in diameter. And the documentation on the way these well diggers came to St. Andrew's Kirk and worked is very interesting. Men and women worked, point number one. Point number two, they belonged to a community of well diggers. And this community of well diggers would marry only within itself, probably to keep the science of or the knowledge within itself. It's a common caste issue in India, as you know. So they would marry only within themselves. The men would do the digging, the women and children would be used in sifting all the debris that come out of it and taking it elsewhere and throwing it away. They apparently had a fairly strong union system, in the sense that you couldn't sack anybody for bad behavior. Once you had hired that group to come together, you had to tolerate them no matter what they did. And secondly, de Havilland, to give him due credit, institutes a system of pension for the women whose husbands die in the process of the construction. So it's not as though there was nobody killed while the church was being built. In the process of digging, men fell in, debris fell on them, they were suffocated, they had to be extracted. There is a very famous recording of two women claiming compensation because their husbands were killed, and de Havilland writes a very sympathetic note to the government that these two women require pension. The other peculiar, or rather not so peculiar trait that is recorded is all of them drank themselves silly all the time. So the Tasmac of today obviously is a proud successor to, if the average Tamil is drinking himself silly all the time, as we know, it is, I think we go back to the well diggers themselves. And de Havilland writes very sympathetically again that it's probably because they have to continuously dig into the ground, and they are also forever covered in slime and slush. Because they are digging into water-bearing areas, there's a considerable amount of water coming in, and secondly, they have to remain underwater for a long period of time in order to position the terracotta shell. And in order to forget their pain and probably their fatigue, they drink a lot, so they are forever drunk, these people. And it is with those reasonably spiritual people, should I put it that way, that this church or this Kirk was eventually built. So it's a wonder that it is still standing. And this is the foundation plan for the Kirk. This is a very well-known drawing, and I'm sure all of you have seen this before. The positioning is not exactly even. The wells are not positioned in symmetry with each other. And secondly, the drawing sadly does not distinguish between which is a terracotta well and which is a brick well. They are all together. It also says very clearly that this is only the positioning of the major wells. So probably there were minor wells as well under this particular foundation. We do know that a total of 150 wells were sunk and they were allowed to settle before work on the Kirk really began. Prior to that, for easing the movement of the material for the construction of the Kirk, he puts up what is known as St. Andrew's Bridge, also built by Thomas Fiott de Havilland, and today this is Gandhi Irwin Bridge. So this is somewhere here, this is where the St. Andrew's Bridge stood, not very far from here. I've already covered the story of Moor House. Then you have the magnificent interior, which with the story that the sky of Scotland is painted in the dome. I assume that's a true story, but I'm sure you would know better. I have no idea about that. But having constructed the Kirk and having put up the dome, they find that there is a dreadful echo in the church. And Havilland is confronted with that, and he says that it's the voice of the Reverend that's responsible for it. I have nothing to say as far as the Kirk is concerned. And he says that over a period of time, the masonry will settle, and the chunam will also have time to spread out evenly, and you will find the echo dies out. I don't know what period of time that is. We still have the echo in this particular Kirk. That's a close-up of the dome, and that is the exterior. Now, the very interesting thing is, as Mr. Muthaiya said, it's very unlikely that the East India Company funded this church to any great extent. They must have probably just given them their blessings and said that you go ahead with constructing the Kirk. So you find that at the entrance portico, over the pediment, you have the word Jehovah. And where do you have the coat of arms of the East India Company? On the back side. So that was de Havilland's joke on the East India Company. That he decided that he had to honor them some way, but he put them up on the portico which nobody was ever going to see. So completely forgotten on the rear side. That was the Scotsman's way of getting back on the East India Company. And that is how the Kirk was eventually constructed. I got to know from Mr. Gabriel Satyanathan that there is, in their time, their equivalent of a time capsule under one of the columns, where a glass bottle filled with coins and a note saying that in the reign of King George or whatever, this Kirk is being constructed. That apparently is buried under one of the pillars of the Kirk. This was news to me, and later I did check it, and there is a very clear documentation about that as well. Having constructed two churches very successfully in Madras, de Havilland becomes a hero of sorts. And after that, for the construction of any church in this city, he is going to be consulted till 1828, when he is going back to when he goes back to Guernsey. The St. Matthias Church is coming up for renovation, and John Law puts in a bid for the construction of the St. Matthias Church. De Havilland puts in a bid as well, but John Law's bid is much cheaper, and so the government decides to go with John Law. And Law's church also has a steeple on it. But you have to consult de Havilland before you put up a steeple, because he's shown that two steeples are standing. So when they consult him, he says no. St. Matthias Church cannot have a steeple. And they ask him why. He says, don't you see, it's a security risk. A steeple over there, and the enemy, when it comes in, it will be able to roll up its guns to the top and position it from there and shoot cannons onto Fort St. George. So the government said no steeple, which is why St. Matthias Church does not have a steeple. The original height of the St. Matthias Church steeple was the same as the St. Andrew's Kirk and the St. George's Cathedral steeples. In case there was a security threat, it could have come from here as well. But nobody was willing to question de Havilland, which is why, and the Reverend Westcott's account of the Church of South India says, the St. Matthias Church is a standing testimony to de Havilland's spite. That is how he documents this whole construction. De Havilland then goes back to England, where he lives almost till 100. I think he lives up to 90, if I'm not mistaken. and lived happily ever after. In Hindu tradition, anybody, you can be a great sinner, but if you build a temple, everything is expiated, you go to heaven. So I'm sure the same thing happens in Christianity as well. De Havilland built 2 churches and lived very happily thereafter. That completes my Kirk story. Then I go on with the Egmore story. The other name that comes up in this vicinity is that of Senji Palani Andi, whose photograph you see over here. Pulni Andi, as his name is written in English records. And after that, people have been forever debating on what his original name was, but very much Senji, that is Jinji, and very much Palani, very much Andi. But a man who made a lot of money, so was not Andi for a very long time. Now this was a man who studied in the Madras Medical College in the 1850s, passed out with the degree at that time, and then goes to England in order to qualify so that he can join the Indian medical service back in Madras. There is some racial discrimination involved as to why he was not called and all that. He finally goes to Edinburgh and then studies at the University of St. Andrews. And having qualified in 1860, comes back to Madras, converts to Christianity, and then becomes the chief vaccinator in Calicut, which is where he lives for a very long period of time. Then having come back to Madras, he forms what is known as the Indian National Church, which is his version of Christianity, which he feels will be a multidisciplinary, multi-denominational form of worship. And he buys up much of the property around the Kirk, including the land on which the Egmore station is now standing. Pulni Andi goes back to England. He marries an English woman and finally settles in England. But he was also a Freemason of Madras, and he founded the Lodge Carnatic, which was the first lodge that allowed Indians to participate in Freemasonry, and appears to have been a very interesting personality of his time. Then Mr. Muthaiya was mentioning the Reverend Carr and the St. Mark's Chapel. This is his memorial, sir, inside St. Mark's Chapel, thereby proving to you that I was not pulling a fast one, but I have really seen the chapel, and it stands. So the Reverend Carr goes back a century before Palani Andi, and he was the man who really gave the orphans asylum in Madras a significant life. Founded earlier to the Reverend Carr, but he was the man who really took it forward. And he was the one who also said that the asylum could take up printing as an activity. And therefore the Orphans Asylum Press came into existence. Many of you may remember the Madras Almanac, which was a 1,500-page book which used to be brought out every year, giving all kinds of minor details about the city. The street directory, the telephone directory, where the doctors live, what were the post offices in the city, what is the currency exchange, what time the ships come in, everything. It was like an encyclopedia for Madras that was brought out by the Madras Orphanage, and that was brought out by the Reverend Carr. After the Reverend Carr's time, the orphanage shifted to where Senji Palani Andi's house stood. So that became the male civil orphan asylum. The female orphans asylum joined it later. Later on, of course, as Mr. Muthaiya said, it became the St. George's Cathedral. But not very far from here is also the Egmore Eye Hospital, the Institute of Ophthalmology, Madras. This is the second oldest eye hospital in the whole world, after the Moorfields Eye Hospital in England. Moorfields Eye Hospital having begun in 1802, the Regional Institute of Ophthalmology begins in 1819. So in the next 1 year, it's going to complete 200 years. I'm sure the government will demolish that building over there and put up a monstrosity to commemorate 200 years. They've already begun dismantling parts of the compound wall from what I can see. But inside this building, there is a magnificent museum for the eye. How many of you have been there to see it? You have. I haven't. So you've got one up over me. One day I must go and see it, but Mr. Muthaiya has written about it. He's even published all the drawings that are there about the eye diseases. In fact, that's the reason why I decided never to go and see that museum, because those drawings were so frightening to see. But they are there inside that museum. This ugly building is the original police commissioner's office. You've got Police Commissioner's Office Road, and this building stands on it. The man who built it Also built the Senate House, the Presidency College, the Victoria Public Hall, P.R. and Sons, Central Station, Buckingham and Carnatic Mills. Robert Fellows Chisholm, the architect who gave Indo-Saracenic architecture a new meaning. Obviously, he had his off days as well. So this must have been constructed on one of those days. So this is the Police Commissioner's office, the original building. And today this is listed as a heritage structure. So it is not maintained because it's a heritage structure. So when you go to this place and you ask them, why are you not painting it? They'll tell you, sir, heritage structures are onnume pannakudadunu sollirukanga government. So that's why the building is in this condition. This is on Police Commissioner's Office Road. This is the Egmore Metropolitan Magistrates Court, known as De Monte's house at one time. Now don't ask me if it was haunted. Everything connected with De Monte is not haunted. And because this name is not written anymore here, it's not written as Demandi either. Because the government insists on writing Demandi Street, Demandi Colony, Demented Colony in a few days from now. But this Egmore Metropolitan Magistrates Court was De Monte House, as I said. And for a brief period of time, it also served as the home of the Presidency College before the college moved on to its campus in the Marina. Of course, the Museum Theatre, the Connemara Public Library, and the National Art Gallery, which is behind it. Magnificent piece of architecture, not very far from here. What is often forgotten is that this government, the Connemara Library and Government Museum, had a tower that stood on top of it, and that was the part of the original design, designed by Henry Irving. But when Henry Irving left, his successor Harris did not want such a large tower designed by his predecessor, so he said it's structurally unstable and had it demolished. So it's from then that the ADMK and the DMK have learned that whatever your predecessor does, you undo that. So that's a standing monument to the way our government functions. We also have the Institute of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Women and Children's Hospital, Egmore, built in the shape of a female pelvis by G.G. Gifford, who was the superintendent of the hospital in the 1880s. The hospital itself goes back to the 1840s and was in Egmore even in the 1840s. How many of you are familiar with the Rajaratnam Stadium and the South Coovum River Road that runs beside it? That is where the women's hospital was before it shifted to this particular location. This location, this construction was in the 1880s. It is still a great center for excellence, and lots of the less privileged people come here for their treatment. We also have the oldest archive in, is it in the whole world, sir, or is it the oldest archive in the entire Commonwealth? It goes back to the 1670s, when the East India Company decided that every government transaction would be recorded and stored. And today the Tamil Nadu archive is opposite the Egmore station in a house that was originally called Grasmere, and that is this property. It is the oldest archive. It also functions that way. So any document you ask for, you will get it, but after you have grown reasonably old. So I have had experience of this place when I was doing my book on Bangalore Nagaratnamma. So if you went there and asked for a piece of paper, you had to be prepared to spend the bulk of the day sitting there doing nothing. And during that time, the officer in charge will tell you all about his physical troubles, his stomach ailments, why his wife is ill, and all that. And you've got to nod sympathetically and say, there, I'm sure everything will be fine, and all that. Now, where is my document? Yeah, you'll get it soon. And then after 4 o'clock or so, you will get a file, which can be one of two things. They'll either give you the original, which is the greatest horror, because imagine a document dating to the 1690s being given to somebody whom you don't even know. And that person can probably tear out chunks of it or manhandle it or whatever, but they'll give it to you. That is one shock. The other shock is to say that everything got lost in the flood of 2015. The document that you have is not there anymore. So this is one of the two things, but it is still a wonderful repository. People interested in research have no option but to go here. Digitization is supposed to be happening, but at what speed? No idea. The man in charge is always suffering a punishment posting. He'd be the previous chief secretary. Once the government changes, he's shunted to the archive. And when I did my book on Nagaratnama, I used the archive extensively. And one of the things that you do when you go to this archive is you give them a commitment that if you publish a book, one copy of the book you will present to the archive. So I was young and innocent in those days. So this was around 15 years ago, no 10 years ago. So I go there with my book and I'm meeting the director of the archive who was a former chief secretary. So I go and meet him and I say that, you know, sir, I have written this book based on my research in the archive. So I'm giving you this book. He says, okay, I'll take it with me. So I said, what about the archive? He says, forget the archive, who's interested in it? Then I said, how are you, sir? He says, I'm retiring next week. Everything being well, I'll be on my World Bank assignment in the next 1 month. So can you imagine a chief secretary becoming in charge of the archive and then being hired by the World Bank? Who's the loser? We are the losers. We've not been able to use that man for his obvious talent. So this, anyway, I was digressing from the topic. This is a photograph of the Egmore station. Can you recognize that? This is a photograph dating to the 1880s. This is not the present structure of 1914 that we all recognize. This was the terminus of the South Indian Railway Company in Madras in the 1880s. And this photograph taken by Sir Robert Staines of T. Staines and Company. The man, T. Staines and Company, the 150-year-old company which is headquartered in Coimbatore, and a great churchman, a great Christian, a man who built churches, a man who built schools, who did a lot for charity in the Nilgiris and in that part of the world. He was an avid photographer, and this photograph is in his collection of the Egmore station. Certainly I can't recognize a single element out of it. So the Egmore station comes up on the property of Parni Andi, the property of the orphanage, and all that put together really becomes the Egmore station. This, I do not know how many of you will recognize, but the success of the Egmore station largely depended on this property. This was Edinburgh House, which was on Warnells Road. Warnells Road is recognized for Albert Theatre today. Next to Albert Theatre is this building which is in the process of being demolished now. Today when I came, I saw them with crowbars and axes working quickly so that nobody can write an article about it and prevent demolition and all that. So Edinburgh House, probably this was the Edinburgh House where the Presidency Feeder School started. We have no idea because it is documented that the Presidency College's feeder school in the 1840s began at Edinburgh House in Egmore. Now, was this the property? We have no clue. But this is known for far more interesting things. This is where the Royal South Indian Ice Factory existed between the 1890s and 1950s, run by a man called Ramsay Ungar. Ramsay Ungar, many people believed, was Ramaswamy Iyengar who converted because he needed a knighthood. But that is not true. They were good Christians. And Ramsay Ungar ran the Royal South Indian Ice Factory over here. And the success of the Egmore railway station, as I said, depended on this because the ice had to travel to the Spencer's refreshment room on a continuous basis from here. The Ungars were very well known in Madras. One of the Ungars was the contractor for the Ripon building. Along with Tatikonda Nambermal Chetty and others who were involved, he was one of the subcontractors to Ripon building. Even today, his name is engraved on Ripon building. When you go, you'll find built along with many other names, Ramsay and Company. That was the company that was promoted by the Ungars. You also have East Snook. This is a photograph. Don't forget that radio came to Madras, radio came to India in Egmore. The first ever radio broadcast was by the Madras Presidency Radio Club in 1924, and that was in a property known as Holloway's Gardens. Where is Holloway's Garden? How many of you know Co-optex? That was Holloway's Garden. That is where the first ever radio broadcast happened in the whole country. Run by C.V. Krishnaswamy Chetty, the club folded up 4 years later. Then the radio service was taken over by the Corporation of Madras. Then All India Radio. This is All India Radio's first office on Monteith Road. now, of course, All India Radio is where it is, on the beach. I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation. The Egmore Ladies Recreation Club. I do not know if any ladies here are members of the Egmore Ladies Recreation Club. Some of your mothers may have been. In 1911, founded by English and Indian women so that women from both communities could get together and learn how to mix. And so you had this wonderful sight of Tamil women in 9 yards playing tennis, table tennis, badminton. Two of them, Babuka and Balaka, I know very well, they completed 100 each one of them, and they played table tennis till they were 85 or some such thing. And so they were all products of the Egmore Ladies Recreation Club. The Egmore Ladies Recreation Club would in turn give rise to a number of things. One is that it encouraged women to come into the world of performing arts. So prior to this club, the Devadasis were the women who really performed in public. It encouraged women of other communities to come forward and start performing. So that was one. The second thing is the Guild of Service, started by made large or powerful by Mary Clubwala Jadar, was really a product that came out of the Egmore Ladies Recreation Club. Mrs. Waller, who founded the Guild of Service, was a member of the Egmore Ladies Recreation Club. She and other co-members were the people who really took it forward, and from then on, as you know, it reached great heights. The Egmore Ladies Recreation Club is today where the Raja Muttaya and Rani Mayame Kalyana Mandapams are. Don't ask me how the Chettinad family got hold of the land. It did. The Ladies Recreation Club now lives in a room of this size inside that property. At one time, they were owners of 100 grounds of land in that corner. This is what happens. The Freemasons, I mentioned them to you earlier, saying that, you know, how Moore House, the Freemasonic Lodge, was right here. The Masons were to come back to Egmore in 1918, when they acquired their property on Commander-in-Chief Road and then put up their building, which is where the Masons meet even today. It's a magnificent piece of architecture set in a large compound on the banks of the river Kuvam. Really worth going and taking a look at it. Some of the great personalities who came from your locality: Rukmini Lakshmipati, who was a freedom fighter, Congress minister, M. Rajgopal Naidu, who founded Rajgopal Motor Works, and then the Halda Typewriter Company. I'm sure many of you must have typed letters on the Halda typewriters, man who founded it. T. Sundara Rao Naidu, remembered in Sun Theatre, man who was mayor of Madras and who also took the midday meal scheme from Ayodhyadas Pandidar and introduced it in many schools long before M.G. Ramchandran and Kamaraj did, but completely forgotten. This is the Royal Hotel that stood on Commander-in-Chief Road. The road behind it curved, and so when this hotel became Victoria Hotel, that road became Victoria Crescent Road. Today it is known as P.V. Cherian Crescent because of Dr. P.V. Cherian, whose photograph you see in the middle along with his wife Tara Cherian. Both of them mayors of Madras, Tara being the first woman mayor of Madras. Dr. P.V. Rajamanna, the first Chief Justice after independence in Madras, also lived on the same road. Also, V.L. Ethiraj lived on the same road, after whom the Ethiraj College at the end of the crescent is named. It's remarkable that 4 great personalities must have lived on one narrow stretch at the same time. This is a beautiful house of Egmore just behind Dasa Prakash. Dr. K.N. Kesari, who was one of the best known Ayurvedic physicians of Madras, lived in this particular house. It's now been demolished, but in its time it was remarkably beautiful. Behind this house, in a small cul-de-sac, lived Bala Saraswati, the greatest Bharatanatyam dancer of all time, before she moved to Ramanathan Street in Kilpauk. Also in Egmore was a unique music sabha called the Jagannatha Bhakta Sabha. It was on the veranda of a house called Veda Vilas on Egmore High Road. Today Veda Vilas is a colony by itself. The house was that big. And in the veranda of the house, these two men who hated everybody else in life. In fact, the second man, Ragaraman Jayenga, wrote probably the most poisonous biography that you can ever find. It's got less about his life and more attacks on everybody else whom he knew. It's a very gossipy book and I love reading it once in a while. But they ran this music sabha in the veranda of their house. And nothing could stop the music performances from happening. Even if there was an earthquake or a thunderstorm or a fire, the music performances would continue if it had started. So on a particular day, there was a music performance going on and one of the daughters of the house went into labor. So Mutanna, the man on this side, tells the people, you just continue listening, we'll attend to the girl. And they take her inside and amidst all the screams, the music performances is going on. After half an hour, they come out and say a girl child has been born. The concert never stopped. The girl child born on that day is Mrs. Y.G. Parthasarathy. Going almost up to 100 now and going on forever. So thank you so much. As I said, it's not a very structured presentation, it's just a collection of information. Mr. Muthaiya will say you threw everything including the kitchen sink into this presentation. I'm sure I'm going to hear that tomorrow.